I'm glad that you're here today. We're doing a marriage series right now, and we want to offer something a little bit beyond that. We're offering a little retreat, marriage retreat, end of March. If you are interested in that, I'd encourage you to go ahead and just scan this QR code. We've got an opportunity for you to sign up. If you don't do that now, but you want to discuss it later, look into it, that's fine. You can find it on our website or in the Church Center app, which we talked about earlier. But it's March 21st through the 23rd. It starts Friday evening. It'll go through Sunday morning. It's going to be an opportunity to just be encouraged, to be built up, to be helped and assisted. It'd be a great thing for you to sign up for. We think it's very reasonably priced. We think it's going to be very useful and good for our marriages. There's other times to give you way more detail than that. If you scan this, you'll find a lot of detail and get you started. We'd love for you to participate if that's something you're interested in. And again, we think it's going to be something very useful and good. Okay. Now, years ago, I was interviewing at a church for a youth ministry position, and they were in the process of getting to know me, and they'd invited me in this interview to bring my wife because they wanted to get to know her as well. They wanted to do, they actually had this idea. They wanted to do this little exercise where they wanted to interview me and ask me a few questions, and then they wanted to make me leave, and they wanted to ask her the same questions with this idea. They thought that they wanted to get into our marriage, figure out whether or not it was healthy. They didn't want our marriage to compromise our ministry. And so they bring me in. They started asking me these questions, right? One of the things that they said was, I want you to rate your marriage on a scale of 1 to 10. And so I said, it's an 8. And I said, I think it's good. We're solid. We have a good foundation. We're in agreement on most things. We're not perfect. We have room to grow, but we have a good relationship, and we're committed to one another. We love one another, and we're on a good foundation. And the men, nodded and approved of my answer. Sent me out of the room. They bring Christina in. They go through the same process, and they ask her to rate the marriage on a scale of 1 to 10. She said 5. Which shocked the guys in the room. But then she explained. She said, we're solid. We have a good foundation. We're in agreement on most things. We're not perfect. We have room to grow, but we have a good relationship. We're committed to one another. We love one another, and we're on a good foundation. Said the exact same thing I said. 8 and a 5, right? Now, I don't know what you would do, okay? If I asked you to rate your marriage, scale of 1 to 10, I don't know if you'd say an 8 or a 5. But I know that every single one of us does have room to grow. Every marriage has room to grow, some more than others, but we all have room. The pain of growth is usually what keeps us from growing. On the front end this morning, I want to let you know that even as we're just beginning this, I want to tell you that we're going to talk about something that I don't think you're going to want to do. I don't think you will. Our word today is rooted in the idea of restraint and self-control. That's not the word that we're going to be using, but what we're going to talk about is going to require you to restrain yourself. And it's not going to be your natural inclination. No one's eager to do this. No one wants to hold themselves back. But I think you know that many of life's best things require restraint in order for you to receive them. So what if I could promise you that it works? It doesn't work because I have a verse in the Bible that says it, even though there is a verse that commands it. It works because it's true, and I think you know it's true. And even if there were no God, and you could do whatever you wanted, there were no rules saying that you had to do certain things certain ways, it would still be in your best interest to listen in and consider trying this, because what we're going to talk about today will make your marriage better. But you have to do it. And I dare you to. In fact, if you take what we talk about this morning, you try it, it would be as if you looked at your spouse and you said, I love you more than I love me. Which is a lot of what Doc talked about last week, right? It's a lot like this guy named Jesus we talk about all the time. But the opposite is also true. If you're not willing to try this for the sake of your marriage, then it sounds like your spouse, I love me more than I love you. Which sounds like selfishness. And it's hard to be married to someone who's selfish. You know that, don't you? Because we're all married to someone who's selfish. Now, how many of you would you consider yourself to be a gentleman? Gentleman is defined as someone who's courteous and honorable and polite. Usually that's the way that they treat outsiders. It's when you hold the door open for someone, or you say kind words, or you show generosity. It's being patient and kind and joyful, all parts of this idea of being a gentleman, right? But what about in your marriage? Does being a gentleman apply inside of your marriage? It seems like it's easier to be a gentleman in public than it is in private. The word that we're going to be talking about today is gentleness. And it seems like gentleness exists in a whole lot of places before it exists in our marriages. And this isn't a male issue. This isn't just about gentlemen. This is as much an issue as for men as it is for women. And if you look at this word gentleness, Oxford Dictionary defines it this way. It says it's the quality of being kind or being tender or mild-mannered. It has this idea of softness in action. And with this definition, I can't help but think of this guy, Ned Flanders. You guys know Ned Flanders? He's from The Simpsons. He's a neighbor to Homer and Marge. He's a great guy. He's God-fearing. He's kind. He's mild-mannered. He's soft. And he's constantly taken advantage of. He's the butt of jokes. He's laughable. He's weak. He's often despised. But he fits that definition of the Oxford Dictionary. He fits it perfectly. Because the definition is missing a very significant piece. One of the things that could help us is if we step into a different language. If you go into the New Testament and you find the word gentle and you kind of trace its history back in the Greek language, you come across this. The Greek word for gentleness is prautes. Prautes. Historically, the word originally described that space, the space between having a hot temper and having no temper at all. Two very different perspectives living somewhere in the middle. And I think this definition gets at something that our usual understanding of gentleness misses. Gentleness only exists when there's an opportunity to not be gentle. When harshness is as equally available options. Otherwise, it's just weakness, right? So to be kind or tender or mild-mannered is gentleness if you have the ability to not be kind or to not be tendered or to not be mild-mannered. So what I'm saying is this: the foundation of gentleness is actually power. It's authority. It's the ability to use force, but choosing to restrain, to be gentle. A gentleman is someone with strength, someone who could do harm, but instead treats people with gentleness and kindness. Let me show you how this plays out in our lives. I believe that there is a life cycle of power and a correlation to our capacity for gentleness. Now, this is not scientific. This is actually completely made up by Ben Webb, all right? But I think it's true, okay? I think that there's some stuff here that's going to be very true and applicable for your life, okay? There's a natural progression of power and maturity as a person grows into adulthood, so long as there are healthy family dynamics, right? And that's the important stipulation. Because if this process breaks down at any stage, then dysfunction occurs. And if someone doesn't progress in a healthy way, it creates issues down the line. Some of you have problems in your marriages because your home growing up didn't help grow you in a healthy way, right? Because one of the signs of health is self-control and restraint. The ability to withhold your strength and exercise self-control is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of maturity. Restraint and self-control are evidence of strength and maturity. And so let me show you how this plays out over the course of our lives. Okay, we're going to start out as babies. Now, ironically, babies, I think, have complete power. Complete power. And it's not actually, literally true because they're little helpless, like bundles of fat. Okay, like there's not much going on, okay? But nonetheless, they scream and everyone comes running, right? They control their home. They cry. They get whatever they want. Everyone serves their need. And as we grow out of infancy into the toddler phase, we begin to lose some of that power, right? In a healthy situation, adults start teaching toddlers that they're not in authority, even though toddlers still feel like they are. And so they cry, and they'll usually get what they want, but not always. And they make demands. And those demands are often met, but not as consistently as before. They begin losing some of that power. And then from the toddler phase, we move to adolescence. Way down there. Some of you are there, and you can't figure out why you're miserable. There we are, right? I believe we reach the lowest level of power in this phase, especially in the tweens, the early teen years, right? Young teens often feel like nobody listens to them, which is kind of true and for good reason, okay? Like there's a reason why, right? But, they can manipulate and they can do their best to control authority and become the one in charge of the house. But in a healthy environment, adolescents, they can make demands, but there seems to be little giving into them because they don't have authority and they don't have power, right? Now, as we grow out of adolescence into young adulthood, we start to gain some of that power back. Young adults slowly accumulate responsibility. They accumulate some authority, both personally and professionally. They begin growing in responsibility. And at that point, they start to make demands, just like we've seen in these other life stages. And sometimes someone will actually listen. Sometimes someone will take the request seriously. Maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's in a relationship, but a young adult can say, hey, I want things to be a certain way, and sometimes for the very first time, someone actually listens and participates. They're gaining something back, right? And then young adults slowly gain more and more power and authority, and they move into a new phase of life when they get married or they become a parent, and suddenly now they have complete power in some situations. And they have a large piece of responsibility over people. They can make demands, and people are actually expected to respond to that authority. Other people are supposed to respect their position. Now again, all of these phases have the potential for dysfunction. A parent with zero authority in a household run by a toddler or an adolescent, those exist. You know those homes. It might be your home, right? But it's not healthy. And a manager who's disrespected by their employees, that's not how it's supposed to be. In a healthy progression, power decreases until a person is responsible enough to gain more power. But since gentleness is built off of the foundation of power and authority, then there should be a correlation between the two, the role of power and the ability to be gentle, right? So let's compare these phases with the ability to be gentle, right? Can babies be gentle? Not really, right? They're demanding, but they have zero control over their own bodies, zero capacity for restraint. If they want something, they demand it, they get it. There's no holding back, no restraint. And I think that's because, practically speaking, they can't do anything, right? But there's something for us to learn here. Gentleness is not a natural trait. It's a learned behavior. We teach gentleness to our children. We teach them self-restraint and to have control over their impulses. Some of you have problems in your marriage because your home didn't teach you self-control or restraint. You didn't have a healthy balance and you weren't taught gentleness, and now you carry that into your marriage. Step back into our example here. A baby isn't capable of gentleness, but a toddler maybe a little bit more so, right? Toddlers tend to be tyrants. Doc calls them barbarians. He's right. They're forceful. Your job as a parent is to teach them restraint. And when a toddler is sweet, it's shocking, isn't it? You get excited. You go grab your phone to video it so you can send it to your friends to prove that you're a decent parent, right? Because you need those little bitty wins. They happen from time to time. They start learning that. They're growing in compassion, developing gentleness. In adolescence, a little bit more so. They tend to be judgmental and harsh, but something begins to change in them, especially in a healthy environment. There's a growing desire to care about things outside of themselves. They're still learning restraint. They're growing in compassion. They have zero power or authority, but they're developing gentleness. And then young adults are capable of being gentle. Hopefully by this stage, they've learned how to restrain themselves. They have more authority and responsibility. And a healthy young adult will exercise that authority carefully and in calculated ways. They're going to choose to be gentle. And then the parent, the married couple, can they be gentle? Absolutely. But I want you to see a shift here. As we've gone through these different ones, we've asked, can they be gentle? And it's yeah, they can be a little bit more. There's a little bit of growth. But when we get to this last point, this isn't like, yeah, they could be a little bit more gentle. At this point, we should say, no, they better be. They'd better be gentle. They have authority and they have power. They have the right and the position to demand, but they must have the ability to do so carefully and gently with self-control and restraint. And if they don't, then the home is just as unhealthy as when the baby or the toddler's in charge. That's what they look like. A person becomes dangerous when they have power or authority, but they don't have self-control. Now, what I want you to see is that once we've learned restraint, we have a higher capacity for gentleness. And that capacity for gentleness will go along with our capacity for power. To be gentle without power doesn't mean anything. It has no purpose, no meaning, unless you hold a position of authority. So let's take it a step further. Let's step into the Bible. There's a guy named Paul in the New Testament, and he's a missionary and a church planner, and later he's going to become this guy who writes letters to these churches that he helped start, right? And he's writing these letters that makes up a large part of our New Testament. And a couple letters that he writes are to a church in a town called Corinth. Paul wrote lots of letters to them. Two of them we have in our New Testament. We call them 1st and 2nd Corinthians, even though they're probably not the first or second letter that he writes to them. Nonetheless, those are the two that we have. And in 1 Corinthians, you're going to find some harsh language. Paul's writing to a church that is full of problems. Their leaders are competing for authority with one another. Some leaders are even undercutting Paul. They're trying to discount Paul, the very guy who helped or start this church, right? And they're trying to find just more opportunity to gain power for themselves. On top of that, sin is running rampant in the church. No one is holding anyone accountable. Instead, you have a culture where they celebrate sin. Godly accountability is missing. And that's what's happening in this church when Paul writes this letter to them, and it's harsh. He asks a question in 1 Corinthians 4. It has nothing to do with marriage, but I want you to stay with me. He says, "What do you prefer? Shall I come to you with a whip or in love with a gentle spirit?" I bet you've never heard a sermon preached on that verse before. All right? Follow me. Paul has the authority to be the bad guy. And he can because he's the one who started this church. Even from afar, he holds a rightful position of leadership and authority over this church. He has every right to show up with a whip, to lay down the law, to make them suffer the consequences of their actions. Or he could choose to show up with gentleness. But here's the key. It's the fact that he can show up with a whip that gives weight to his choice to offer a gentle spirit. If he didn't have the power to bring the whip, his gentleness doesn't mean anything. It just means that he's weak. And this is what makes 1 Corinthians so powerful. It's a strong letter. It's harsh at times. There's moments where it doesn't feel gentle at all. In one case, Paul actually tells them to kick someone out of the church. Strong, straightforward language. But these people had crossed a line. They didn't care. They were celebrating their sin. And yet, I would argue, Paul's harsh words were far gentler than if he had actually shown up with a whip. Now, what does it matter? Who cares how Paul treats them, right? Who cares if he's harsh with words instead of being harsh physically in person? We all understand that the whip sometimes gets the results we want, right? Why does Paul pursue gentleness? We get our answer later in 2 Corinthians. Now, if you read 2 Corinthians, especially if you read it right after 1 Corinthians, you'll notice there's a major tone shift. 2 Corinthians is much softer. It's gentler. I believe 1 Corinthians was already gentle because his words were nicer than the whip, but 2 Corinthians doesn't even at all feel the same way. In fact, there's even one moment where he encourages them to accept someone back to the church who's repented. Maybe that guy from 1 Corinthians, right? And in a very simple statement toward the end of the book, we catch a glimpse of why. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, simple verse. By the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. That's the missing piece. Remember that Oxford dictionary we started with that wasn't complete and full? This is what it's missing. Paul pulls our attention back to Jesus, giving us the best possible example of what gentleness looks like. And this is why we should care about being gentle. Because the more power, the more control, and the more force you have, the more gentle you can be. It's like the image of a soldier with children in a war zone. It's like the image of this police officer who's helping shave a homeless man. There's There's gentleness here. These are gentlemen, men who have the capability to be hard and forceful, yet they show compassion and care. That's gentleness. Paul says that's the way of Jesus. We read this verse earlier. Matthew recalls this prophecy from Isaiah about Jesus in his gospel, Matthew chapter 12. And he says, speaking of Jesus, he will not quarrel or cry out. Listen, when Jesus came to this earth, he didn't show up to fight. He didn't come to start fights or force his own way. Instead, it says he will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break. He's gentle. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out. He's gentle until it's time. Until it's time to lead us to victory. Now take a moment and capture this picture of Jesus. The very nature of his ministry was gentleness. There's moments that break those tendencies. You have this moment with his disciples on the Sea of Galilee, and this massive storm comes in, and Jesus has his disciples. Several of them had been fishermen by trade. They'd spent their entire lives in boats, and they're terrified, thinking that they're about to die. And in that moment, Jesus speaks, and he calms the storm with his words. Yeah, he has authority and power. There's another time when a large crowd presses in around Jesus, pressing him towards a cliff. They have every intention of killing him. And something, I don't even know what to even call it, magical, I guess, happens. Something happens. It's like he freezes time, and Jesus decides to just walk through this crowd, and he leaves them behind. Something about him. He's powerful, and he has authority. And yet he's the same one who welcomes little children to him. But this, Jesus isn't gentle just because he's nice to kids. Being nice to children and allowing them near him, that's not what makes him gentle. He's gentle because he can command storms and he can walk through riots, and yet he restrains himself. He doesn't quarrel. He doesn't fight. He welcomes the most fragile to himself. One of the best modern images of this kind of power and restraint comes from C.S. Lewis and the character Aslan, who's a lion. Reminds me of this drawing. This hangs in my parents' home. It was done by a friend of theirs 25, 30 years ago. And I love it. I don't think Jesus looked anything like this. But I love the image of the massive shoulders and muscles swelling. Because so often we depict Jesus as a soft, hippie-like figure. He's kind and he's generous to all. And it's true. He's compassionate. He's kind. But don't forget, he's a roaring lion. There were times when Jesus used harsh words, and if you read carefully, you're going to recognize he probably raised his voice. There's a time when he calls people whitewashed tombs. He said that you look nice on the outside, but you're full of death. There's a time when he called people snakes. There's a time when he called his best friend, Peter, he called him Satan. At times, Jesus was harsh with his words, and it might not seem gentle, and yet the growl of a lion is far more gentle than its claw. And his ministry was one of gentleness. The same Jesus who spoke stars into existence, the same Jesus who spoke harshly to those who opposed him, climbed onto a cross for our sins and for the sins of those who would oppose him. And there were people on the scene who thought it was a sign of weakness. I think it's what gentleness looks like. It's choosing the growl over the claw. And it's ultimately because gentleness is rooted in love. That's what we talked about last week, right? First comes love, then comes gentleness. Gentleness looks like truth, but said in love. And sometimes it may require you to say the hard things. Sometimes it means doing the hard things. But love always means you want to be as gentle as possible. The desire behind how we treat one another, that's what matters. And so do you desire to punish, or do you desire to be harsh, or is your desire to build the other person up? Because if your desire is to build them up and encourage them to see the best of them and their potential, then we're talking about gentleness. We're not talking about harshness. Think of a coach making hard decisions with his players. If an athlete isn't meeting expectations, the coach needs to deliver truth. but he does so in a way that builds the athlete up, that's designed to help them reach their full potential, not in a way to simply tear them down and make them suffer the consequences of their behavior. And so this is where it gets real personal for us, especially in our marriages. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 2. It says, the Lord's servant must not quarrel. It's that same word we mentioned earlier about Jesus, that when he shows up, he didn't show up to fight. He didn't come to fight. He wasn't here to make people suffer the consequences of their actions. And so if we're going to follow him, well, then that means that we don't quarrel either. So instead, the servant of the Lord must be kind to everyone. Do you think that applies to your marriage? He has to be able to teach. Do you think that applies to your marriage? He's not supposed to be resentful. Those who oppose him, he must gently instruct. Do you think that applies to your marriage? And hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth. The servant of the Lord is gentle with those who oppose him, not with those he agrees with, those who are in opposition with him. And it doesn't make sense until we think like Jesus. Because Jesus wants those who oppose him to get right with him, and it likely requires gentleness. And so the servant of the Lord should care more about people being right with God than being right with us. That's interesting, isn't it? We aren't here to start fights. We're supposed to be kind and gentle, even to those who oppose us. Does that sound a little bit like marriage? Sometimes marriage feels like the union of those in opposition. So when your husband didn't listen to what you said earlier, do you desire to punish with harshness, or do you have a desire to build him up? If you want what's best for him and for you, gentleness builds up. When your wife refuses to see things your way and insists on her way, do you desire to punish with harshness, or do you have a desire to build her up? If you want what's best for her and for you, gentleness builds up. Here's another one, Galatians 6. Brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore him gently. Restore gently. The restoration doesn't happen with harshness, but with gentleness. And then I love this part. He says, but watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. Now, I've always read that verse with the idea that we must be careful when helping others with their sin, because there's a chance that what they're struggling with could entice us, could pull us into that same sin. And I think that's true. I think that's a great application of this verse, but I wonder if we took this and we laid it over the top of marriage. What if sometimes the temptation that Paul warns us about isn't the temptation to fall into the same sin, but rather the temptation to stop being gentle, the temptation to be harsh, the temptation to be hurtful. So think about it. Your spouse is caught in sin. They have some sort of a problem. Maybe your husband's eyes wandered where they shouldn't have been. Maybe your wife's language is disrespectful. Maybe your husband is emotionally unavailable and inattentive to your needs. Maybe your wife continues to choose herself and her wants over your needs. And you have the right, you have the position, you have the power, you have the temptation to drop the hammer on them. Watch yourself. Don't sin. Be gentle and restore. No one has more power in your life, no more ability to hurt you like your spouse. And there was a time, maybe even still for your parents, and the deep wounds that they can cause. Some of us still carry some of that with us. But marriage is different. In marriage, you chose that person. And when that person, the person that you picked, wounds you, it hurts deeply. It's a sharp pain. That's why gentleness is so important. There's lots of reasons to pursue gentleness in your marriage. One of them is that you need to pursue gentleness because you want to avoid falling into sin yourself. It's that verse we just looked at, right? Or you could pursue gentleness as an act of obedience to Jesus because that's who he was in his ministry. Or, third, maybe you pursue gentleness because it just simply works. If If you're wanting a hack for your marriage, this is it. You want people to be gentle with you, and so you be gentle. Encourage gently, even when your spouse messes up. It's far better received when handled with gentleness and encouragement rather than this hammer of harshness. And you don't have to like this, you don't have to want to do it, but it will help your marriage. It works. Now, everything that we've said about gentleness applies to marriage, but it isn't limited to marriage. Even if you aren't married, your gentleness in any relationship has the power to build and to restore. And guys, all of us need to hear this, whether you're married or unmarried. As followers of Jesus, our gentleness with unbelievers can be world-changing. Proverbs 15 says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. Isn't that the truth? And it's not true because the Bible says it. It's true just because it's true. You've seen this be true. Gentleness turns away wrath. Harshness stirs up anger. It's true in your marriage, and it's true in your friendships, and it's true in your workplace. It's just true. And as we look around at the world we live in, we see wrath and harshness and anger everywhere. There's war everywhere we look. Everybody's fighting. Everybody's stirring up anger. Everybody's using harsh words, causing more anger. So what if we looked different? What if we as a church were serious about gentleness and the peace it could bring? That's what our leader has called us to do, starting in our marriages, but not limited to that. If we looked like Jesus, we'd be a place of gentleness. If we look like Jesus in our marriages, they would be better. If we look like Jesus, our gentleness would bring people together instead of stirring up anger and dividing. And so very simply, be gentle. Be gentle because Jesus was gentle. Be gentle because you're selfish and you want a better marriage. Be gentle. I dare you to try it. And maybe this whole idea of Jesus is a new idea to you begin with. Maybe it's time for you to start a relationship with him. I'd love to invite you to have that conversation. We're going to have a song here. I'll be sitting up front. If you want to talk about what it means to be a follower of Jesus, again, I'd love to have that conversation. If you need any prayer, we have an elder in the prayer room back behind you. We'd love to have that conversation. And when this service is over, you didn't miss your opportunity. If you need to talk about something, let's grab me. Let's have those conversations. Let's work that stuff out. Why don't you stand and let's sing.